Hello everybody, thanks for joining us today, and it's a pleasure to be able to present to you some information about one of our projects we're working on here at NDS in Western Australia. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we're presenting to you today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. With me today is my colleague, Terry Collins, who's the project lead for our Skills Passport project. My name is Jacquie Daisley, the Program Manager of Workforce here in WA. You might already be aware of this RMIT and NDS scoping report, which was published in 2018, and it was on the disability skills portfolio, issues and options. This formed the basis of an application that was made by NDS WA to the Department of Social Services Jobs and Market Fund. We were seeking some funding to progress the concept of the Skills Passport using WA as a pilot site, and an initial scoping that focused on information relevant to recruiting and onboarding. So it was not intended to limit the capability or the utility of the passport, but it's rather about making sure it works, it's useful, and it actually creates the efficiencies that we expect before we go any broader. I commenced on this project in January this year, along with the project lead, and since then we've had a change in staff, and Terry is the new project lead who started in March, and then we've had some limitations on our ability to engage with service providers as a result of COVID-19. So we've had to be fairly flexible with our project plan and our milestones and timeframes. Having said that, this project needs to be delivered in full by the 30th of June 2021, and that includes doing a targeted pilot, any improvements that come from that pilot component, promotion, uptake in WA sector. So we've got another 13 months or so to be able to do that. So Terry, what are the issues that we're trying to really address here by implementing a Skills Passport platform?
Yeah, so there seems to be a consensus that there is quite a large duplication of training across the sector. In WA, about 30% of our staff are casual or part-time, so they may be working for multiple providers and undergoing the same training several times. So the cost to pay people to attend training and the associated administrative cost is something that is becoming a concern to support organisations. Also, there seems to be a big variation in the length of inductions that's carried out depending on who you work for, ranging from 3 hours to 3 weeks induction. So that's a huge disparagement there. And then requiring workers to retrain unnecessarily actually doesn't recognise the workers' skills that they bring to the role. So that's another area that we hope to address. We do hope that through collaboration with the sector, not just in WA, we've collaborated with some national organisations as well, and we have, as a team, collaborated with some of our national colleagues too, so that we can look at how an employer would be satisfied that the skill set that an employer has received in one training course with a provider is something that is of the same standard that the second provider is delivering to as well.
So do you see that as one of the more complex issues that need, I guess, resolution as part of this broader project, about that, comparative acceptability of those competencies that you're reflecting in a passport?
Yes, yeah, that is one of the major areas where there needs to be collaboration with the sector, but there is a huge disparagement as to what is being delivered across the sector.
Okay.
So that agreement is hard to come to.
Yeah, okay. And so with the some of those other issues, I know that from some of the providers that I've spoken to, there was some mixed opinion about who sort of would theoretically own the passport. And from what I understand, you know, where potentially some of the savings are, maybe at the service provider level. And yet, I suppose, if notionally the employee owns the card, the platform, the information within that, it seems that that's where the cost will land. So have you got any thoughts or some feedback that you've received from providers around that?
So some of it is dependent on the scope as to where the passport can go. There does seem to be more options around job matching opportunities and opportunities for upskilling of staff. So there would be more of a reason for there to be buy-in from the employee and from the organisation as well. There does seem to be a lot of consensus and a request for government support by way of subsidy for the initial rollout. That seems to be there because the disability support organisations are not so sure of the training savings that they're going to make within that first rollout.
Yeah. Has there been much evidence that you've been able to gather or is more broadly available around the extent or the magnitude of the duplication of training?
That's one of the really complex areas for this at the moment. There is a consensus that it's happening a lot. As I mentioned before, people are saying that between 30 and sort of 70% of their staff potentially have already done the induction modules that they have just asked their staff to do before because they potentially work for other people. But sorry.
I suppose one of the things that when I was reading the RMIT report, there was certainly a lot of feedback, anecdotal feedback that there was duplication, but in terms of hard data, that seemed to be a bit more difficult to gather.
It's not even data that organisations are collecting. Whether it's possible to collect that data hasn't been established, just because the answer has been they don't at this moment in time.
Okay, so I guess whatever the skills passport ends up looking like, we need to be fairly confident that we're delivering those savings and efficiencies rather than just replacing some of the costs that they already have in duplication of training with another sort of administrative cost. So one of the key issues, certainly that I know that you've spoken about before, is about the reliability of that data that is uploaded onto the passport. What sorts of options have you been considering there with service providers? So
most service providers are under the agreement that a lot of their senior coordinators do actually sign off competencies for staff around medications and mealtime plans and behaviour support plans, things like that. So if there could be a bit more flexibility and recognise the skill set of those staff, we might be able to get staff more quickly through those competencies and the data would be reliable. The fact that a workflow could then go through to the training or HR department to second tick the verification that it had come from that organisation, most organisations seem to think that they would be able to agree that that was a good process.
Okay. So once something was uploaded to the passport and had either been verified by the training provider directly or by the employer with the training provider, that then would be verified and be able to be relied upon by subsequent employers. Is that how that would work?
That's how it would work, as long as the sector would agree on what that baseline of that would look like.
Okay. So with the Skills Passport platform, certainly the RMIT report gave some examples of existing skills passports that were already available. Where have you gone with that in this project?
So we looked at the broad existing amount of software in this area, and we then looked more closely at a smaller number that seemed to tick some of the sector's needs. And we have been liaising with WA providers, some national and our colleagues that are nationally based, around what the software needs to be able to deliver at a basic level. But then there is talks around the fact that some providers might like the opportunity to buy more from these IT software organisations, the little add-ons that could come with it. So that's quite exciting.
Yeah. So what sort of basic level of information would you think would be held in that passport?
So entry-level skills, first aid, CPR, minimum certifications if they have any, police clearances and work with children clearances would be good to be on there. Driver's licenses, they are relevant to the sector, and the NDIS worker code of conduct module as well.
Okay. So, for example, if I was an employer and someone during their induction program brought in and showed me their original working with children's, their motor vehicle driver's license, perhaps some other certifications, you know, their original certificates, I could view those, potentially go onto the passport, verify that I've cited the originals, and then if that person takes a second job somewhere else, that provider could then see that I, as a disability provider, have already done that work, therefore they wouldn't have to repeat that level of verification. Is that how those sorts of things would work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The passport is aimed to help with onboarding and deal with the time frame it takes for a staff member to receive the job and be inducted and actually then take on their first shift with the client. So if we could see that information up front as to what they're able to do when they're on shift, then potentially they can go straight from there to the house. And onboarding, sometimes it can take up to 3 weeks, but yet this could be pretty much immediate. You could have them in the house the same day or the next day.
Yeah. So what you talked earlier about having that, you know, with providers wanting sort of a base level of functionality through the Skills Passport platform. As you also mentioned earlier, these sort of options have been around for a number of years and have, and IT moves pretty quickly, the developments. So what are some of the other components that may be useful in, you know, say a phase 2 passport?
Yeah.
Or potentially a, you know, a gold standard passport? What would you say some of those functions might be?
Look, I think that some of the skills passports that we've looked at have a really good training and upskilling function to them, where staff are able to go online and receive some industry standard training around certain areas that maybe they haven't worked in before. So this can help us in areas where new client comes in and the property and the staff go from a basic mealtime plan to an enteral feeding mealtime management plan. So there could be a training element to it. A gold standard, you might be able to provide a job matching element to providers where staff will be able to upload their skill sets to say that they're looking for hours or work elsewhere, and then employers would have the possibility to go on and see these staff, see the skill sets that they come with, and match them up to the clients that they've got and they're needing staff for.
Okay, one of the other points that I know have come up in the past is particularly for smaller organisations that haven't necessarily felt the need to have a more formal learning management system or alert system, as you know, potentially certifications are you know, coming up to due date or renewal date. With some of these platforms, would they have the ability to kind of turn on those sorts of additional functionalities if that's what a provider was seeking? Yes. If it was a low cost response, at least?
I believe that that is there. That is part of what we're exploring at the moment. But I do believe that the softwares that we are talking to both have the option to be able to buy certain components of it that were relevant to your organisation.
Okay. But there would be no obligation to do that at a basic level?
No.
Okay. So in terms of the Skills Passport project where it is at the moment, what are your next steps, Terry?
So we believe that we've got a good draft for the key features of the Skills Passport. So right now we need to be consulting with the sector to make sure that that the information that we're working to is relevant to the sector. But we also need a business analyst to have a look and review the software applications that we're looking at, so that they can put their technical hat on and ask the questions that maybe I'm not going to ask because I don't have that technical background.
Yeah, okay. So with the IT Skills Passport, I suppose in my head I think of a card, someone else might think of an app on their phone. You know, what's the feedback from the sector in terms of how it can be readily used by both the worker and by perhaps the HR department or the training officer? What are your feelings there?
Yeah, some of the sector are concerned that the knowledge and the skills and IT literacy of the staff won't be there in regards to having a massive technical solution. Others are quite, they've done a lot of work with their staff recently. They've bought in learning management systems, client management systems, and their staff have been upskilled in using these systems, and they're doing really well with it. So some of the sector is not as concerned in that area as others, as long as it is simple, easy to use, and pretty self-explanatory, like a lot of websites are nowadays. Then I think that the sector is quite positive that whether it is an app on your phone or a card, depending on what you prefer, that the information will be easy to get off of that system and be there to interpret for both the staff and the organisation.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. Particularly applicable also to individuals who self-manage their own plan and employ their own staff.
Absolutely, and we are definitely collaborating with WACE and some of those organisations that work with the self-managers of the sector.
Okay, well, that sounds fantastic. So I just, were there any final comments, or should we throw straight open to questions from some of the people who perhaps are listening right now?
Happy to go to questions.
Okay.